Jesus is praying for his disciples on the eve of his crucifixion. He knows they're in for a shock. He knows that there are forces that will seek to scatter them and to destroy them, and so he prays for them. He prays, among other things, I ask not on behalf of these, but on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. And there we are, right back with that theme we talked about last week, Jesus' favorite theme. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. May they be in us. And if it was worth Jesus repeating, maybe it's worth our repeating. God's life is a community of love. The Father and the Son's love for one another in the unity of the Spirit. And we are invited into that community. God's life is not one of these gated communities, and we're the beggars outside at the gates wanting to get in, longing futilely to get in. God's life and love is more like a comfortable, roomy, welcoming inn. And the door is wide open in Jesus. To use the memorable, if slightly awkward phrase of the Lutheran theologian Robert Jensen, God is participable. That didn't help. But as our hymn writer Charles Wesley wrote in a hymn to the Holy Spirit, that he was longing to be plunged in the Godhead's deepest sea, lost in thine immensity. Plunged in the Godhead's deepest sea. Jesus is standing on the coast of God's life and saying, come on in, the water is fine. Come on in. But it's not for our sakes alone. There's another reason that Jesus prays that we might be one in him as he is one in the Father. He says, so that the world might believe. Now, if you've been reading through the Gospel of John, you might have asked yourself this question. What in the world does Jesus mean by world? From the first chapter of John's Gospel, when it says, he was in the world, but the world didn't know him, to the third chapter where it says, most famously, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. To this chapter today, John 17, where if you were counting along as I read, you would have noticed that Jesus says the word world 17 times. You English majors think he needs a synonym book because he's repeating himself too much. Those whom you gave me from the world, I ask not on behalf of the world. I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world. The world has hated them because they did not belong to the world. As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. What in the world does Jesus mean by world? Well, one of the reasons it's hard for us to get what world means in John's Gospel is we have, in our kind of cultural and religious memories, this idea of something that is worldly. You've heard of worldly things or worldly pleasures, right? We think of worldly things as a kind of class of things, pleasures that somewhere along the line we've been told Christians should avoid. And each generation, it seems, has its own notion of what a worldly thing is. One time it was playing cards, or dancing, or going to the movies on Sunday afternoons. Worldly things. For us, I suspect it's more like using non-recyclable paper products or getting that extra shot of espresso in a whole milk latte. A worldly pleasure. But in John's gospel, world is much, much bigger than that. It's a comprehensive category. It's not a narrow class of things. World names all of reality oriented away from God's purposes and plans. All of reality oriented away from God's purposes and plans. It's what we were born into. It's the water that we swim in. It's the way our existence is structured that shapes our seeing and how we live. It's not a narrow class of things that we just need to give up. But it's a comprehensive realm, a reality we need to be rescued from. We need to be pulled out of. And that means you can give up a few worldly habits in your life. And still we can be decidedly of the world. A beautiful example of this is that book that became the movie The Help. Do you remember the genteel white women in The Help? They were anything but worldly by our traditional standards, right? They wore white gloves. They wore pillbox hats. They went to church twice a week. They washed their hands more than a doctor at Duke Hospital. They were anything but worldly in the traditional sense. And yet, their whole lives were structured and determined by the pervasive reality of racism. It determined their entire lives. It shaped the way they saw the world, and they didn't know it. They're perceiving African Americans as inferior and subservient. To them, it was just the way the world is. This is the natural way the world is. The world. Not a few habits they had to give up, but an entire way of existence that they and we need to be rescued from. The world. And when we begin to realize this, then we can see that the world in John's gospel is all those forces that keep human beings and the rest of creation from living into God's overarching purposes for creation. All the forces combined. Of course, racism and discrimination, characteristics of the world. Class division, struggle, and poverty, the world. But also one we might not think of, hyper-nationalism that causes us to see others as enemy, the world. Or economic determinism, the way this force called the economy shapes and structures how we see everything, how we begin to see other people as commodities and the creation as something to be bought and sold and used up. The world. And here's another characteristic of world. Our revulsion to anything that's weak and vulnerable. We want to hide it, get it out of sight, anything that reminds us of human frailty and pain. And that's one of the reasons, 20 years ago, when Pope John Paul II was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, people began to wonder and ask, is he going to retire? He was on a trip in Poland, and a reporter asked him, Pope John Paul, are you thinking about retiring? And he said, there is no such thing as a Pope Emeritus. Shows you what he knows. But people were beginning to ask and to wonder and even hope. They were asking, what in the world is he doing? Traipsing around the world with Parkinson's disease. Letting the world watch him stumble, letting the world hear his awkward speech. What in the world is he doing? Isn't it time for him to disappear? Do we really have to watch this? That was world speaking. But John Paul II knew better. He knew in Jesus' language that he was no longer of the world. But he was still in the world. And he knew God still needed to use him. Because the world needed to see how incredibly close God is to those who are weak and vulnerable and suffering, those who we want to hide. He also stayed in the game because he knew we Christians needed to realize that being no longer of the world, swimming in the sea of God's life and love, is not withdrawal and disengagement from the world. God's life, this life that we enter, this inviting in life is also a sending out life. Jesus said, as you have sent me into the world, so I send them into the world. Called out of the world, reoriented, then sent right back in. Or to use another ocean metaphor, it's getting caught in the rip current of God's love. I'm from the Midwest. We didn't worry about rip currents when I was growing up. On our annual family vacation to Indiana Beach, an amusement park on the shore of beautiful Lake Schaefer in northern Indiana, there was about 50 yards of sand and you could swim in the water. We didn't worry about the currents. But when I was in college, I walked through the common room in our dorm enough times and saw out of the corner of my eye my roommate watching Baywatch that I am well aware of the danger of rip currents. And so when Ginger and I took our family with the kids to a real beach for the first time, and I saw those warning danger signs, rip currents, and then I saw the lifeguards like David Hasselhoff right there with his binoculars and four-wheeler and flotation device, and I saw those yellow warning flags. I thought, what in the world are we doing? We're going to let these kids go in that water? What if they get caught in the current? What if they get sent out? Jesus said, as you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. Sometimes I think churches should have yellow caution flags outside. That we should have signs outside that say warning, come on in, you're welcome in. Meet God here, make a home here, but watch out. Because you might get caught in the rip current of God's love. And who knows where you'll end up. Well, we know where we'll end up, right? We'll end up among the people whom world says don't matter, who world says do not belong, who world wants to hide away. We'll end up among the weak and the vulnerable. We have a lot of small groups here at the church, as you know. Some of them meet in homes, some of them meet here at the church. There are ways for us to welcome in, to say, come on in, meet Jesus, meet one another, make a home here. But this spring, we have a small group that's not meeting in a home or at the church. It's meeting over that way at Henderson Towers. Henderson Towers is a nursing home facility for very low-income residents. It's kind of like a place where the world can hide away weakness and vulnerability so we don't have to see it. But there are members of this church who got caught up in that rip current, in that sending out love of God. And so every Friday morning, there's a small group that meets at Henderson Towers. Half of the group are members of Duke Memorial. Half of the group are residents of the nursing home. And they spend their time studying the Psalms together and getting to know one another. And most importantly, getting to know this sending out God who brought them together. As you have sent me into the world, Jesus says, so I send them into the world. On January the 17th, a new ordinance went into effect here in Durham, an anti-panhandling law. So now it is illegal for those homeless men and women who are used to seeing on the medians and at intersections. It's illegal for them now to beg for assistance in those places. It's another picture of world. Because seeing these men and women as we're driving past, it's unsettling. It'd be better if we could keep them out of our sight and forget that they exist. So now if someone stands in a median and asks for assistance from a driver on the driver's side, they can get fined $250. And if they can't pay the $250, they go to jail, which means, of course, they go to jail. Durham Congregations in Action is the organization that has its offices in our building, and we're members and support them through our budget. And DCIA, along with some other Christian organizations, in a week and a half are having a meeting here at Whitford Hall to raise awareness in our community about this issue, but also to stand in solidarity with the homeless men and women who we're not allowed to see anymore. And I understand that some of these Christians are going to allow themselves to get caught in that current of God's love, sent out into the world. They're going to let God send them to the medians and the street corners and the places where the homeless are no longer allowed to stand. So in a few weeks, we might be driving our cars to Durham, and we'll pull up to an intersection, and there we'll see followers of Jesus, where the homeless used to stand. And they'll be holding signs, maybe signs that say, "We'll work for change." And they'll risk getting fines and arrest. They'll risk going to jail. They'll let this current of God's love send them wherever God thinks is necessary. Jesus prayed, "As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world." Maybe churches that worship Jesus need those caution flags out front, those warning signs. If you come in here, you don't know where you might end up. As you have sent me into the world, so I send them. Who in the world are them? Who in the world is he talking about? So I sent them. Who in the world are them? I'll let you decide. Amen.